This is my first time in the great state of Iowa. It's long overdue. And I don't know how many of you know this, but here at the University of Iowa, there are two iconic legends in my field, Dr. Kate Kefeller and Dr. Bruce Ganz, who really, I think, set the stage for a lot of what I do in music. And so I'm very grateful to be here and thankful for all the work that you've both done and how you've kind of led the way for us. Now, I'm going to try to give you a whirlwind tour tonight about my life, and I'm going to try to explain to you how my obsession with music has somehow led to a medical career. Now, I do have some disclosures. I'm just going to get these out of the way. These are collaborations I do with cochlear implant companies, and I'm working with a startup company to try to come up with a molecular treatment for hearing loss. None of these disclosures are relevant for anything that I'll be talking about tonight. Now, everybody thinks about different things when they think about music. I'm not exactly sure what comes up in your brain when you think about music, but for me, I think about this, okay? And so, this is the temporal bone, and so hopefully everyone here has two in their heads, one on each side. And the way that you can hear anything, so the fact that you can hear my voice at all, it's kind of a miraculous process. So sound, think of it as just vibrational energy in the air, okay? So it's ripples in the air that go through your ear canal, travel down that ear canal, hit the eardrum, where they set it into microscopic motion. That motion gets converted down three bones 1, 2, and 3, the malleus, incus, and stapes, where it then goes into this spiral-shaped structure called the cochlea. And here you can see it in cross-section right here. Now, an amazing thing happens in the cochlea because sound energy, which is sort of acoustical energy, becomes electricity. And so another way to view it is that acoustics exists between the world and here. And then here on out, there is no more acoustics, okay? How you hear anything, how your brain reconstructs this auditory experience is done through electricity. Okay? So in fact, listening to music is a neural process as much as it is starting from an acoustic process. So let's hear a little bit of how this electricity sounds together. Can we turn that up a little bit? This excerpt needs to be loud. Okay, so that was 5 seconds of Stevie Wonder. Does anybody not feel a little bit better now than they felt 5 seconds ago? Right? To me, that is the essential experience that I had my whole life listening to music. I always thought, how is it possible that this abstract concept, this sound that's coming through my ear, I cannot see it, I cannot even comprehend it, somehow it's transforming my life. It makes my world better. It makes me want to be a better human being. It makes me understand my pains and my sorrows. I felt like somehow music was everything I could experience in the world. And so that feeling of wanting to understand this immersive experience of listening to music is why, in fact, I became a hearing specialist. And so I never had the conviction to be an artist. I know a lot of the people in this room are artists. I never had that conviction. I think a lot of artists, you're born an artist. You know you have no choice but to be an artist. I had a different thing. I had the sense of I was probably born not to be an artist. But yet I loved it so much that I couldn't really get away from it. And so I said, let me try to study this field of hearing medicine, hearing sciences of otolaryngology, and try to understand what's happening in our ears and in our brains when we have these musical experiences. And when I got there, this is what I heard a lot of. Yeah? Blips and bleeps. And so that's where the field of otolaryngology and audiology was when it came to music. And I always found it incredibly frustrating that that's really all we were doing. And so I realized rather quickly that there's no way I'm going to understand this musical experience by looking at the eardrum. Just wasn't going to work. So I had to kind of turn my attention towards understanding the brain. And so for the past 2 decades or so, I've been really trying to understand how it's possible that our brain cooperates with our ears to give us these musical experiences. But not just to perceive it. You know, as a sort of struggling jazz musician, I always wanted to know how is it possible that the brain creates it. Now, there are a lot of different forms of creativity. I'm going to just show you a little bit of the kinds that we care about in this world. Culinary creativity, visual arts. I understand you have a Pollock here in Iowa, or had a Pollock, and that's currently on loan in Europe. Yes, it's on, I guess, flood damage repair, yes. Yes, I think it will hopefully come back soon. Architectural creativity, athletic creativity, literary, cinematic, scientific, surgical creativity. This is my team performing cochlear implant. We do limit the creativity in the OR, okay? So it's not like we start surgery and say, you know what, let's just be really creative today, just sort of see what happens. Now, Yet in the OR, and Dr. Gans can attest to this, you're improvising all the time because you never quite know what you're going to find, and many times you have to deviate from the plan because suddenly you're confronted with something you did not expect and you don't know what the proper solution is. The kind of creativity that I want to talk about is the kind that a jazz musician does. And for those of you that have never seen Hiromi, you're in for a treat. This is a video of Hiromi improvising. And I don't know if it's possible to get the volume of the speakers in the room up a little bit, but is there anybody that does AV that might be able to get the volume up? Well, if not, we'll keep going on this. Here's a video of Hiromi improvising. Yeah, it's an amazing thing. It's hard to believe. And so if you ever get the chance to hear her, please do so. And so when I hear this or I see this or I observe this, I think to myself, how is this possible? How is it possible for a human being to do that? And then I think to myself, well, why should we just stop with posing the question? Why don't we actually try to answer it? And so a lot of what I've been trying to do is to understand the answer to that question. How is it possible that somebody like Hiromi can do what she does? Now, I want to go back in time a little bit, lest you think that creativity is simply something that just jazz musicians do every once in a while. This is a fossilized bone flute. Okay? Now, this was found, maybe the oldest musical instrument, from a bone of a bird. Dates to 35,000 years ago. Okay? So 35,000 years ago, somehow human beings thought that it was important to spend time to make a flute. And you'd think that human beings had a lot to take care of back then to just simply stay alive. Also, what repertoire are they playing? There's no teachers, there's no sheet music, there's no radio. And so the earliest music probably was improvised. And it was probably very related to the emergence of speech and language capacities in human beings because it's a form of communication. Now, if this doesn't convince you, I want to show you a very interesting bird that was studied by my friend Ani Patel. And this bird can dance. I've seen that video many times. It's hard to not think that that bird is funking out to the beat. Right? And there's not that many other interpretations I can give it. And so then I think, well, how is it possible that a bird can funk out to a beat that didn't exist when it was biologically created? So turns out that animals and the brains of humans are really good at one thing, which is to identify patterns. Okay? And the way we survive is by finding regularity in chaos and understanding that there's a predictability to that. And that's a whole basis for how we can do things that are timing related. And this bird is doing that. It's extracting a timing pattern, and it's, I think, enjoying it, but at the very least showing us that the capacity to extract a pattern goes way back. And I think that music is that. It's ordered sound. Okay? It's taking this acoustical energy and putting it into some order for us so that our brains can make some sense of it. Whether that purpose is functional or aesthetic is another layer on top of it, but we know that what our brains is doing to have that experience is to find some regularity in this chaos. Now, to kind of get you in the mode of thinking of what a jazz musician does, I thought maybe we should do a little math together. Now, probably by now, Dr. Lee's already solved that problem. But if we were to all spend a minute or two and do this problem in our, we'd all actually eventually get to the right answer, which is D. Okay, so D. D is the answer. There's only one correct answer to this problem in the universe, at least the known universe, and there's an infinite number of incorrect answers. Now, let's flip that around to the task that's posed by a jazz tune. Okay, so in this piece called Take 5, there's a melody, there's chords. And when you're improvising, you have to come up with a solution that follows the chords and the melody in some fashion. There's no right or wrong answer. There's an infinite number of possible solutions, and every solution is unique to the individual that creates it. Put another way, if everyone in this room was told to improvise a solo to take 5, everybody would come up with a different solo. That would be true even if this room had 10 million people. Right? Everybody would come up with a different solo. No two would be the same. Now, that's a pretty phenomenal thing, and it gets this idea that the capacity of the human brain for generative thought, to come up with new combinations and new variations, is a fundamental part of how it is that we do things. Now, just because something is improvised, I want to shed the notion that somehow it must be simplistic because you didn't have time to really think about it, okay? And I'm going to demonstrate this by showing you an animation of a famous piece by John Coltrane. At first, you'll see the melody, and then you'll hear him improvise, and watch what he does. Improvise here. Again, it's astonishing to think that that was created on the spot. And the harmonic complexity of what he's playing is really out of control. I mean, you could spend years analyzing what he just blurted out on the saxophone. And I think I could take 5 years trying to write a solo like that and it would never come out as inventive and as interesting as that. I just couldn't do it. And so just because something is improvised doesn't mean that it has to be simplistic. It also doesn't mean that it's random. Okay? These are very carefully selected notes placed and timed in a very particular way that's based on years of training, years of study, and to in some extent, years of variation of what's already been learned. And so this is not just conjuring stuff up it has no basis. It's stuff that's been practiced and performed in some ways, just not quite that way. Now, back to the question of how is it possible that that's done? How does the brain do that? The first idea I think that one must accept as a scientist, if you're going to look at this, is that artistic creativity is a neurologic product. And while I think that's a very basic truth that most scientists are comfortable with, not every artist, I think, conceives of their art as a neurologic product. But I think that we have to kind of start there and say, you know what, it's a function of our brains that we can actually produce something like an artistic utterance. Therefore, let's try to study that function like we study any complex biological process. And so this is kind of what we need, okay? So we want a way to look inside your brain while you're doing something, and that something should be something musical. Now we have a modern version, which is called functional MRI. Have any of you had an MRI scan before? Wow, a lot of people, sorry. It's a lot of MRI scans. So, as you are all aware, MRI scans are pretty spatially confined. They're very noisy, they're ergonomically challenging, they're big magnets. It's not like the right environment to like have a jazz gig, okay? And functional MRI is different than anatomic MRI. So anatomic MRI shows us pictures. What functional MRI does is the following. When your brain is active, an area of your brain is using more resources, it gets more blood diverted to it. And what it's doing is consuming oxyhemoglobin and converting it to deoxyhemoglobin. Deoxyhemoglobin can be detected by a magnet. So functional MRI is basically detecting these ratio changes of deoxyhemoglobin in your brain and saying, that's a part of your brain that was active. It's not going to show us an anatomical cluster of activity like this, but it will show us a statistical cluster of activity like that. So it's an indirect method based on hemodynamics of showing us what part of the brain was active during a given task. And there are a lot of reasons to criticize functional MRI, and I'm one of the first to do so, especially when I'm using it, because it can be frustrating. On the other hand, I would be also the first to admit and defend and say that we know a lot more about how the human brain does complex functions today because of fMRI than we did 100 years ago. And as the method improves, we will know more and more. And so how do we actually do jazz and fMRI scanners? I'm going to show you a video that demonstrates how we did some of these experiments. Now I'm going to demo it for you. I'm trying to make it louder. And this is improvised. Okay, so what you just saw was a brain scan taken in two conditions. One was a memorized performance and one was an improvised performance. And I'm playing the blues. So I basically went back to the most fundamental thing that jazz musicians do, and they play the blues. Now, using that model of having something memorized versus something improvised, you can start to see how you could isolate, maybe, that what's left over, the difference, the subtraction map, might be the neural correlates of creativity. And so we had this paradigm. You know, by the way, that piano took 2 years to make. And it was a running joke in the lab because it never worked, never ever worked. And so this is, if there's any students here, this is a lesson in persistence. Because one day it worked. And I was like, now I'm cooking with gas. And so I had this piano keyboard that was working, and I started bringing jazz piano players into the NIH. And before you knew it, we were jamming in the fMRI scanner. It was like a miraculous thing to watch happen. And so what we were doing was, again, having them memorize this piece on the lower left, which is called magnetism. And we rewrote it for them, and then we would have them improvise. And so just so you can get a sense, they were actually playing real music in the scanner. So the bottom right is a transcription of an improvised solo by one of our jazz musicians that sounds like this. So for fMRI jazz, not bad. You know, like real bona fide music. They're actually playing. Again, this is a 35-key plastic piano keyboard. It's no Steinway, okay? And then we looked at the brain activity. So we condense all this activity together and we say, well, what changed? What changed when you went from memorized performance to creative performance? And in these professional jazz players, there was one really significant finding, which was that the prefrontal cortex, so this is the part of your brain that really separates humans from animals. This is the part of the brain that has developed the most in human beings as opposed to animals, and it's the root of all consciousness, okay? So your ability to comprehend your own existence takes place in your prefrontal cortex. But also, your cognitive, effortful planning and your conscious self-monitoring takes place here. And so what we're seeing is that when these musicians switch to an improvised form of playing, they're shutting down their conscious self-monitor. Okay? They're suppressing their own inhibitory capacities to try to promote the novel flow of ideas. Meanwhile, there's an activated area in the middle portion called the medial prefrontal cortex. This is an autobiographical region of the brain. Really fascinating. If you tell a story about yourself, this part of your brain is active. If you hear a song and say, oh yeah, that was that summer of 8th grade, I remember. That's your medial prefrontal cortex is active when you have that memory and that musical experience. And so maybe what's happening is you're telling your musical story, but without the context of the suppression that's normally provided by your own brain, that gets in your way and maybe makes you less effective at something than you would be if it were not in your way. And you all know this idea of being in the zone, and you all know this feeling that if you were really good at something, and all of a sudden someone says to you, okay, do that same thing, except I'm going to pay you $1 million, suddenly it becomes very hard to do that same thing. You know, I had this experience where I was being filmed for some news piece on hearing loss, and they're like, now we want you to walk from here to there on camera. I was like, okay, I can walk, and also I'm walking like this, right? And so I'm like, what is going on? They're like, no, just walk naturally. I was like, okay, again, I'm like, you know, and so all of a sudden, my brain was interfering with something I know how to do exceedingly well. I know how to walk, okay? I'm a good walker, but not that day, okay? And so the idea is that your brain can facilitate or impair certain automated activities. In the case of a professional jazz musician, they've sort of like lubricated their circuitry. They can shut that sensor down quickly and just start letting these ideas flow out. Now, right away, that raises a lot of questions. And so we have, by the way, I have a lot more questions than answers. I don't have answers for you, okay? But one of the real questions, I think maybe at the crux of music, is this idea that music is a form of communication that we all share in this world, no matter who you are or where you're from. And it kind of is put inside as music the universal language. I think we sort of know what we mean when we say that, but if you actually think about it with any rigor, you see right away, well, music's not really a language, and so let's view it this way. Language is really good at specific propositional thought. It's really good at saying, you know, Kate, let's meet for lunch tomorrow at noon. Now, let's say I wanted to invite Kate to lunch at noon tomorrow by playing my saxophone. I play for 10 years. She's never showing up for lunch at noon because she has no idea that I was trying to ask her. So if music is the universal language, it's pretty bad at doing the things that language is really good at doing. On the other hand, it excels at certain other things, which is to communicate emotion. And so if there's one thing that music might communicate in a way that's better than language, it's the emotional experience. And 5 seconds of music can probably say more emotionally than writing 500 words on a page and trying to describe the feeling of what it's like. Music gives you that feeling without it having to be spoken. Now, I'm going to show you a video of Herbie Hancock's band, Trading Fours. And this is a musical behavior that jazz players do all the time, where they basically have a musical conversation. And hopefully you can hear this dialogue. So hopefully you could hear that. There's a conversation taking place. It's wordless. We don't know what they said, but you sort of know what they were saying. Now, how is it possible that that happens? And so what I wanted to do next was a follow-up experiment to the first one, where this time now we have 2 musicians playing. And so one person is in the scanner and another person is in the control room, and they're going to be playing this piece called Trade Winds. And what they're going to do is break up this piece into 4-bar chunks and either play the 4-bar chunks in a memorized fashion, so it's almost like having a scripted conversation over and over, you know exactly what's going to happen next, or improvise that communication. So you say something, I don't know what you're saying, and I'm going to react to it. You don't know what I'm saying, I'm going to react and back and forth, have this dialogue. And so this is how this works. I brought in some great musicians. Mike Pope is a colleague and a fantastic bass player who also plays a pretty mean piano. And this is a video showing how we did the experiment together. So now we're going to set him up at the scanner. He's got electrostatic earbuds, and you'll see his legs sticking out of the scanner when he's playing. So there's his legs up there in the scanner. Now he's playing. Now we're going to start doing this trading thing. Now he's listening right now. Now he's going to respond back. That's him playing, responding back. Now I'm going to respond back to him. So then we did what a musicologist might do, which is to take a look, we broke down everything that was played, and we broke it down in terms of sort of musical analysis. So things such as rhythmic imitation, repetition, motivic development, contour inversion, just ways to understand the fabric of what happens during a musical conversation. When we had no idea what they did, we called it departure. Yes, so that's departure, yes. So, and then you could break that down. You can say, okay, so this is the percentage with which these things happen. And the other thing we did was looked at something called melodic expectancy. So this is how correlated a piece of melody or some excerpt of music is with what came before and what came after. And what we're looking at here, the black are the control conditions where it's perfectly repetitive because we know exactly what they're playing. And then the red is the improvised conversation. And what we see here is that there is actually, even though there's much higher statistical correlation in the memorized condition, there's a definite correlation in the improvised condition with what came before and what came after. But it's much more random because it's improvised. But the fact that there's correlation between what came before and what came after is an indicator that they were actually listening to one another, that they weren't just ignoring each other, that what they were playing was actually somehow related to what came before, and then what followed that was also related to what they just heard. Now, if you look at the actual brain mapping, it gets pretty interesting. Because when musicians have this wordless conversation, they're in fact using classical Peary-Sylvian, what we call language areas of the brain, so-called language areas of the brain. We all think that we have language areas, so Broca's area, Wernicke's area, these concepts that have been around forever, but don't really tell the whole story, because when these musicians are having a wordless conversation, they are using these parts of the brain to have that conversation. Okay, remember, there's no words being spoken. Yet there's deactivation of something called angular gyrus, and this is one of the key parts of the brain involved in semantic cognition, which is how we know the meaning of words. And so this musical conversation is taking place by the use of these very primitive old language areas, but without the involvement of these regions of the brain that are involved in things like semantics and vocabulary. And so maybe that's how music can be the universal language no matter where you're from, because it is using these very basic communication, auditory communication areas, but without the involvement of the need to know the exact definitions of the words you're hearing. Now, what I'd always hoped in my work, but really just as a curious person, was to understand the art of the kind of musical geniuses that I've revered my entire life. And I've recently got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to look at world-class musicians. And so I had the chance recently to work with this individual who's remarkable. He's 17 years old. His name is Matthew Whitaker, and he's a prodigy. He's a piano player, a Hammond B3 player, and he's blind. Now, he was born blind, and his entire world is music. And so I had the chance to scan his brain about 2 months ago in preparation for a collaboration with the Kennedy Center, and you'll see how we did that experiment next.
I am Matthew Whitaker, and I'm a musician. I'm 17 years old, and I'm also visually impaired.
So today we wanted to see what's happening in Matthew's brain while he's doing a variety of things. One was playing a blues, and one was playing a song that he'll play for the Kennedy Center tonight, and another was listening to music that he liked and maybe listening to something that wasn't as interesting. And that's just having a musical conversation with another musician to see what's happening when two players have a dialogue together, sort of a wordless conversation that's just based on music. The entire time, you're going to be in the scanner room. We're going to be in the control room about maybe 10 feet away from you, but separated by a glass window and a door.
Is it like a recording studio?
It's sort of like a recording studio. So the goal is to understand the neural underpinnings for something as complex and wonderful and mysterious as music. And we have a lot of scientific knowledge about how the world works, relatively little knowledge about how the brain enables the arts. Art has been around throughout eternity. As long as there have been humans, there have been art. Every culture, every historical epoch, there's always been art. And so what I'm trying to understand is how can we use the arts to sort of unravel this complex neural circuitry that gives rise to new ideas.
Technology has come really far. I like how it just kind of analyzed quite musically what I was thinking of. And I wonder what the results will be.
In the end, it seems that humans are hardwired to create, and that may be linked to how humans actually survive.
So we brought Matthew to the scanner, and we had him listen to some economics lectures. Okay? Honestly, we had him listen to this.
In 1930, a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effect of the, anyone, Great Depression, passed the, anyone, the tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which...
So he's listening to that, and this is his brain activity during that stimulus, okay? And so, literally, he's got auditory cortex, which you'd expect. There's a lot of sound. Left lateral prefrontal cortex, you'd expect. There's a lot of language. Medial prefrontal cortex, now that's a default area of the brain. It's interesting. This is what this area of your brain is active when you're not doing anything. And so, I think maybe he's zoning out, and that's what we're seeing there. And then we looked in his visual cortex, and as I said, he's blind, and so there's no activity there. And then we switched the soundtrack on him, and this is normalized to hear Snarky Puppy. It sounded like this. Okay. Now, this was his brain during the economics lecture, and this is what happens when he's hearing music. Okay? Now, again, it's a pretty dramatic difference. Now, one thing that I think, again, this is one person, one unique individual, but we see a lot of visual cortex activity. Okay? Now, we need to delve further into this, but this is very interesting. I mean, he's blind. Now, somehow he's figured out, or his brain has figured out, a way to use his what would be normally visual cortex to process sound information. And if you watch him play, it might start to make sense because you think to yourself, how is it possible that he can do what he's doing? I mean, he's playing organ with pedals and two manuals. I mean, it's really, really crazy what he can do. And so we're starting to see that maybe something like an individual case study can tell us a lot about creativity. And this is a dilemma for science, because normally science works by looking at averages. Okay? And so we want the mean effect size of this and that. We want to know the average effect in response to this or that medication. You never, in the arts, do that. You don't say, oh, let's go hear this average musician tonight. That should be a pretty good experience. Let's go hear this. Yes, this is an average concert. Let's go check it out. Okay? That's not what you do in the arts. Okay? In the arts, you go for the statistical outliers. You want to hear the person that's amazing, that is completely outside the lines of what is considered average. And so we have to figure out a way to do that, because in science, you want to take him and average him with another 100 subjects just like him. But there are not 100 subjects just like him. And so I don't quite know how to do this other than to find a great way to do a case study, or maybe a series of cases and extracting useful customized information out of each one that might start to chip away at our understanding of creativity and help us to build this neural model. Now, the idea of improvisation, the idea of language, and the fact that I lived in Baltimore for many years might clue you into what's coming next, which is that there's a very interesting art form, for those of you that are not familiar, called freestyle. And here's a video of Mos Def freestyling.
Take me to up, place on the BK without pause or delay. Give my life in relay. Don't deal with he say, she say, and working for no cheap pay. The most that beat play. This is what the streets say. Hey, Mr. DJ, when that there's no more game, that jam got me open. Decided to break it broken. From front side to side, then on the back. Never the whack. I come from Best Star Black. From Lewis City, to be exact. Brooklyn!
All right, so let me explain what was going on there. So he is making up rhymes on the spot, okay? And he's not written those before and memorized them. Instead, he's making them up on the spot. And that is freestyle. You see something and a word is given to you and you make it up on the spot. And if you're like me, you see that and you think, wow, that is incredible. If you're like my father, you're like this. You're like, what is that garbage? And so I was like, I was having this argument with my dad. I was like, Dad, you might hate that, but you can't do it. And I was right. He can't do it. He's not like a secret MC in his in another life. So whether you like freestyle rap or not, it's undeniably creative. And so what I set out to do was, in a series of what I can only describe as hilarious experiments, was infiltrated the underground hip hop scene in Baltimore with my lab. And so we brought a bunch of rappers to the lab, and it was really an incredible series of experiments. So what we had them do was first memorize a rap, okay? And the memorized rap went like this.
Memory. Thump. Search. Art. Stop.
Okay, so he's doing that over and over in the brain scanner. And then we had him do words that he didn't know was coming, and he had to rhyme them in. So I thought so you could understand what this is all about, we would all freestyle together a little bit now, okay? I'm gonna tell you the words, like, head, and not. Those are the words. You have advance warning. Do this in your head, okay? We're gonna hear a beat. Like. Head. Not. Now, did anybody have a really awesome freestyle rhyme in their head that they're super proud of? Yeah. It's hard to do, okay? So then if you're like me, when you try to do this, you're like this. You feel your body go like, and you're like, I like football, or something stupid like that, okay? And so let's hear what Slick Vic does with those words, okay? So here is Slick Vic. He doesn't know these words are coming.
Like. Head. Not. Stop.
It's pretty amazing, right? Does it over and over again. I was driving in a car with Slick Vic. Everything we can see on a street corner becomes a rap. Every single thing. So then we looked at the brain activity, and you see an interesting amalgam of what's happening in jazz and what's happening in language. And you see the following. When you do an improvised freestyle rap, it requires language areas of the brain in a much greater way than a memorized rap, which is already a very language-intensive area. So the fact of creating that memory on the spot is a more brain-intensive activity. Okay, so you need more resources directed to your language areas to be able to come up with those activities. Meanwhile, you've got deactivations again in this prefrontal cortex that we think are related to these flow states where you're sort of shutting off your brain. So right now, when you all tried to freestyle, probably this area was super active, saying, don't say that, that's really stupid, that doesn't even rhyme, what are you doing? Like, no, nobody should ever hear this. That's your prefrontal cortex being very active. You shut that off, and then you can let these kind of rhymes flow out. And so we're seeing that, again, maybe this is starting to help us understand the signatures of creativity in the brain. And all of this is to get to this question that I asked earlier about our artistic grades, which is, what is genius? And to help us unravel this, I'm going to show you a video of a little girl who was pretty extraordinary when she was younger. And here she is playing piano. And so this young girl grew up to be a really well-known pianist by the name of Gabriela Montero. And so Gabriela Montero is known for a couple things. She plays beautiful classical repertoire for the first half of her concerts. The second half, she improvises. And she usually takes a theme from the audience. She says, hey, call out some fragment of a song or something that you want to hear me improvise on. And so this is how she improvises to Jingle Bells. Amazing, yeah. So it was a great day for me when she emailed me and asked me if I would scan her brain. And so I was like, absolutely, come on down. And so she did that. She came over and we trained her to use this piano, which is a little disappointing to her. And so now I don't know how many of you have children that are learning piano or have had learned piano, but we did a control condition that's probably a piece you've heard over and over again. It went like this. This probably haunts some of you. Yeah. And then we had her improvise. And listen to what she does in the scanner here.
Improvise.
That piece is so gorgeous. I can't believe that she did that in there on that little dinky piano keyboard. I want to record it, except that's the only recording of it that's ever existed. And she just made it up. Now, and it's, she says, and maybe John, you have some experience. She says that when she's playing, it's like turning on a faucet. She turns on the faucet and the ideas come out. And it will happen nonstop. She goes all day long. She just keep pouring out like water. And then you turn off the faucet and then she goes and has dinner or whatever she was going to do. And so we looked at her functional connectivity of the brain. This is an interesting idea. This is that different parts of your brain have, at different activities, greater functional coherence with one another. So one way to view this is the following. When your brain is in sync with itself, it's working very well, very efficiently. Functional connectivity is greater. And the strength of the lines is proportional to the strength of the connectivity. And so in blue are the improvised connections, and in green are the memorized connections. And what we see here is that for all of these regions associated with imagery, emotion, memory, reward coding, and auditory processing, the functional connectivity is much greater during improvisation. It's almost as if in order to be creative, or because she's being creative, her brain is working really well together. And you probably all have experienced some version of the opposite, which is writer's block. Okay? So why is it that in sometimes you need to write some paper or grant, and it takes you 5 days to write one paragraph? Other times, you write 5 pages in an hour. Same brain, same human being, but your brain is working better in that area. And so the creative brain might be an example of the brain working really well. And what we hope to do is get back to this girl. And so we actually have now an experimental paradigm to look at 9 to 11-year-olds improvising that have never played piano before, and it works like this.
Listen, then improvise.
She's just going to use the black keys. No wrong notes. She'll just have a little conversation with us. Now, the real problem with that whole paradigm is braces, dental braces. Turns out that in the 9 to 11-year-old age range, there's either a lot of poor dentition or a lot of hyperparenting or some combination of both. But every child has braces, and it leads to huge artifacts in functional MRI. So we've been having a hard time recruiting subjects for this study. So if you happen to know 9 to 11-year-olds with perfect teeth that are very interested in playing the piano inside an fMRI scanner and send them to San Francisco, please let me know. Okay? So just in conclusion, I'd just like to make a few points, and we can open up for Q&A. We can measure the creative brain in action. We're starting. We don't know all the answers. We don't have all the methods, but we're starting to chip away. And I think that hopefully this will allow us to begin to come up with a model for how it is that the brain can do these extraordinary things. We clearly have a lot to learn, and it may be that to look at artistic genius, we need to look at individuals rather than groups. And these are the questions that I'm thinking about. How do we evaluate the quality of creativity? How do you objectify something that really wasn't meant to be objectified? What is creative genius in the brain, not in terms of the artistic behavior? if you're participating in creative behavior, does it make your brain more cognitively flexible down the road? Would it be a way to stave off, for example, the effects of, say, dementia or Alzheimer's disease? Would it impart a certain amount of problem-solving ability in your brain, like I said, sort of lubricate the neural circuitry of creative problem solving? And then in the end, maybe one day through this kind of research, we will come up with a way to make human beings more creative. Now, let's say it's as simple as taking a pill and all of a sudden you're 10% more creative. And let's say that it's not that much different than having a cup of coffee to get yourself through your more alert. Right? Maybe one day you could enhance human creativity by understanding which circuitries you wanted to facilitate. And so it's not that far-fetched to think that we might one day understand how to kind of make human brains be a really best renditions of ourselves. And so with that, I want to thank universities and funding sources that I've been involved with and very grateful for their support. I want to thank people in my lab that have done every bit of these experiments with me and without which nothing would have ever been done. Other scientists that I've had the good chance to collaborate with or been inspired by over the years. And then artists that I've had the good fortune to work with for many, many years. I'm truly grateful for their sort of interest in this kind of work and look forward to future collaborations. And hopefully the next time you hear a little Miles Davis, it'll sound like this to you, okay? And so with that, I want to thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions. That's actually a really good question. So to answer your question, not yet. Now we kind of stacked the deck. When we wanted to actually see a difference. And so I wanted to look at people that were very good at this activity. The problem is that it's hard to even do the tasks if you're not a musician at all. And if you're a mediocre, it may be that amateur musicians have a very different pattern of cortical activity because they're not yet able to get in the zone. And so that is a study that we'd like to do next. Haven't done it yet. Yes. Thank you, though.
Do you see any difference between creative flow and impulse control issues?
That's a really good question. So, sort of. Now, let me put it to you this way. There's overlapping circuitry. These are not just the jazz areas of the brain, okay? And so things like conscious self-monitoring and effortful planning, these are involved in almost every form of daily behavior. Now, there's a wide range of pathologies, diseases, medications, hallucinogenic drugs that all impact the function of your prefrontal cortex, affect your self-inhibition. Now, it's probably no coincidence that Sgt. Pepper sounds like it does by the Beatles and that right around the time they were experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs. Okay, and so I guess what I'm getting at is this idea of conscious self-control and inhibition and artistic output and creativity have always been linked. I would say that we have not yet solved or really characterized what that means. Right before I left Johns Hopkins a few years ago, we were about to do a study using psilocybin, which is the functional ingredient in hallucinogenic mushrooms, and to see the impact of that on musical experiences. But we actually never got around to do the experiment, but I'm sure it would be interesting if nothing else. Yes.
I'm curious about the connectivity between, like music, which is a creative activity of sorts, and how that stimulates, like, let's say, dance, which can be completely free-moving, and maybe you could play an instrument that the music causes you to improvise in another way. I'm just curious about the connectivity.
Yes, thank you for the question. So, as you notice, I kind of focus in on musical improvisation in a very kind of narrow way, but there are many, many art forms, as I said, that involve creativity. Dance happens to be one of the hardest ones to do brain scanning on, okay? Not that it can't be done. Actually, there's one of my colleagues in Hamilton, Ontario, did a study of tango dancers using a footboard so their head was still and their feet are doing this kind of thing. And you can do it, but I think the point is the following. In all of the creative arts, no matter what the actual genre or medium is, there's probably something universal in the improvisational creative aspects of the brain that's common to all of these behaviors that we have. In the same way that when you have a conversation with someone you've never spoken to, it's unscripted, or when you're driving home from work and you don't know which way you're going to take home, you find your way home. These are all improvisational behaviors. They're fundamental to who we are as humans. I truly believe if we had not developed those capacities, we would have perished as a species a long time ago. And so we're now starting studies in comedians. And so I've worked with comedians from Second City to try to look at what's happening when they do comedic improvisation, and then visual artists as well, to try to look at more of the universal substrates of this kind of creativity. The other thing we need to look at is things that are not happening spontaneously at a very narrow time scale, but things that happen in a protracted fashion. But it's kind of hard to get someone to write a novel inside the fMRI scanner because it'll take a year, and it's like $650 an hour to use that scanner. And so we have to be pretty efficient with how we get the data out there. But you're correct. There's a strong linkages between all these art forms, but the science is not there yet.
We have time for one more question. It's not improvisational, but if you study synesthesia with music and
Yeah, so the question was whether I've studied synesthesia. So synesthesia is this phenomenon where some people experience a visual phenomenon, usually colors, in response to sound. There's some composers that are very well known to be synesthetes. Scriabin was a well-known synesthete. I have not studied that myself, but we know that there's a lot of sort of cross-modal plasticity that happens between auditory and visual processing, and in some cases that processing can be disrupted so that there's in a way more crosstalk than you would normally have. Some people find it disruptive, and then some people find it sort of. So when I've known several synesthetes, and when I introduced myself, they're like, "Oh, you're green." I was like, "Well, what does that mean?" They're like, "Oh, your name, it's green. My brain is green now." I was like, "Oh, okay." And so they said, "Well, now whenever I meet somebody, there's a sort of specific shade of color that I attach to their name or their face, and it's part of how I conceive of them as a person." And so it's interesting, but there's a lot of, I wouldn't call them diseases, but conditions that we don't quite understand the implications of yet. I would put synesthesia squarely in that category. Yes.
well, I would like to have us all thank Dr. Lim for being with us.
Thank you.